Early in the Korean War, hundreds of war refugees lost their lives due to airstrikes and gunfire by U.S. troops for 3 days, beginning on July 26, 1950. And in October 1999, after 49 years, a U.S. investigative team visited the Nogunri incident site.
U.S. soldiers killed or injured an unconfirmed number of Korean refugees in the last week of July of 1950 during a withdrawal under pressure in the vicinity of Nogunri.
A comprehensive search of records and these veterans' interviews did not disclose any evidence of the issuance of such an order.
Another 10 years have passed. The villagers here lost their parents and siblings to U.S. airstrikes and firing squads. Some had been hurt themselves or barely survived the incident. And to this day, they are unwilling to acknowledge the investigative results that concluded that the incident was merely an accident. Why did the U.S. troops that came to Korea to aid in the war kill hundreds of refugees at Nogunri? And what is the truth behind what happened at Nogunri?
불굴의 정치는 위대한 수령님은 곧 조국이었고 인민이었고 미래여서 50년대의 용사들은 그 어느 고지에서도 최고사령부의 방패가 되어 싸웠습니다.
On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded the South. The Korean peninsula instantly transformed into a battlefield. Unprepared for the North's attack, the South Korean government immediately asked the U.S. government for military assistance.
We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
President Truman, who was on alert for the expansion of Soviet communism, immediately ordered the dispatch of U.S. naval and air forces to the Korean War and appointed General MacArthur as the chief commander. He also ordered the dispatch of U.S. Army forces. On July 1st, one battalion of the 24th Infantry Division stationed in Japan first arrived in Busan. For the next 3 years, the U.S. military sacrificed a great deal for the Korean War. The war saw some 54,000 deaths, about 8,000 people went missing, and over 100,000 men sustained injuries. However, some people have suffered a great amount of pain for many years because of what the U.S. troops had done. Yang Hae-suk was 13 years old at the time of the Nogunri massacre. She lost 11 of her relatives and the sight in her left eye due to the attacks by the U.S. soldiers. Having lived her entire life with an artificial eye, Yang would turn the other cheek if she came across an American soldier. Portrait of Chung Gu-hak hangs in place of a photograph. Chung says he hates having his photo taken. He lost his mother and sister by the bullets fired by American soldiers, and since then his face also has been scarred for life.
Daejeon, 19 July. U.S. forces defending Daejeon are the strongest yet sent into battle in Korea. This battle is a major test. But U.S. forces in Daejeon face tank columns followed by masses of infantry. By overwhelming numerical superiority, the North Koreans breach the perimeter defenses and surge into the town. The Daejeon battle begins and ends in one day. Daejeon falls to the Communists.
When the 1st Battalion to participate in the Korean War lost at Osan, the entire 24th Division was commissioned to fight in Daejeon, only to withdraw after a day. Of the 16,000 U.S. troops that had fought in Daejeon, 1/3 were killed, and the commander-in-chief went missing. After withdrawing from Daejeon, U.S. troops attempted to defend Yeongdong yet again. Yeongdong was a location of strategic importance. If Yeongdong were breached, North Korea could then easily infiltrate from the Chupyeongyang Range into Busan. Despite the assistance of the newly arrived forces, Yeongdong fell to North Korean soldiers at 8 p.m. on July 25th. And that night, before U.S. forces retreated, they visited Imgaeri in Yeongdong. Imgaeri, a village surrounded by mountains, was frequented by people in search of refuge within the region. Especially, there were many empty gold mines used during the Japanese colonial period. The location was the perfect hideaway for refugees. Over 100 people hid in this cave, waiting for the war to end. When the U.S. troops reached Imgaeri, they ordered all refugees to pack up their belongings and leave the village because the place would be turned into a battlefield. The villagers packed up and hurried on their way, trusting the words of the U.S. troops who had promised to help them escape to the south. About 500 to 600 people went into refuge. The villagers were led by U.S. troops in the evening. They passed Jugogri and arrived at Hagari, where they spent the night. The next morning, they continued their travels before arriving in Soseongunri.
여기나 모으니까 앞에 장갑차로 이렇게 갈아막고 미군이 몇 명이 앞에서 지휘하면서 전부 다 철로로 올라가라.
Because there were many American Army vehicles on the road, the residents thought they were being escorted onto the railroad tracks so that they wouldn't be in the way. All of the 500 to 600 refugees went up the railroad tracks, and immediately the U.S. troops started to search their bags and bodies. The people whose bags had been searched then prepared lunch on the other side. Around noon, a U.S. Army field radio operator made a wireless radio connection. Soon afterward, a reconnaissance plane made its way toward the villagers, only to disappear thereafter. Suddenly, a bomber appeared and began strafing the area. They began firing machine guns as well.
그때 내 고막이 나간 모양이 아마 그 고막이 이상이 돼가지고 그 다음 폭격소리를 못 듣고 입으로 이제 물체가 떨어지는 이 감각만 내가 느낀 게요. 그것을 내가 세렸어요. 한 번, 두 번, 세 번, 네 번, 다섯 번, 여섯 번, 7번까지 내가 세렸는데 그렇게 하고서는 아마 정신도 잃었던 것 같아요.
폭탄을 팡팡 거기다가 쏟아놓으니까 오게 앉아서 한 가족이 먹는 가족은 직사해서.
우리 엄마가요 꼼짝을 안 하시는 거예요. 엄마가 꼼짝을 안 하시길래 엄마 이러면서 엄마 머리를 이렇게 하니까 제 손이 이만큼이 들어가더라고요. 엄마 머릿속으로.
뭐가 이만한 돌멩이가 와서 여기를 탁 세리는데 뭐가 이만하게 쭉 이만해요. 내가 보기에 이만해요. 내가 만져봤어요. 하도 뭐가 이자 한짝 눈으로 본 게 달려가지고 이만한데 뭐가 이렇게 큰가 싶어서 만져본 게 눈이 이제 빠진 거예요. 눈이 빠져가지고 이제 달려가지고 있는데 참 겁도 없이 내가 뚝 잡아 뛰어요. 뚝 잡아 뛰게 그때 찌개야 내가 대가리가 이렇게 꾸부정하면서.
The people who survived the attack started to run all about. Some came down from the train tracks and hid in a culvert. But they weren't safe there either. The U.S. soldiers started strafing into the culvert.
여기서로 이제 엄마를 따라서로 막 요려오는데 난데없이 저기서로 총을 쏴가지고 여기를 쏴가지고 일이 나왔어요.
People came out of the culvert and headed for the twin tunnels. Inside the twin tunnels, the refugees once again were strafed by machine guns, rifles, and even mortars from the U.S. soldiers. Many people died inside the twin tunnels too.
철뚝에서 미리 와가지고 이 굴을 싹 들어오니까로 이막 몰려가지고 총만 여기 이 짝은 물이었고 저 짝에 저 또랑물이 이리 갔는데 그 물에 시체가 너스머리합디다. 지금도 눈 가보면은 누구 이름을 부르면서 마지막 죽어가는 그 장면이 내 눈에 지금도 선합니다.
아버지가 그 애기를 동생을 요 물에다 여기다 넣었어요. 물에다가 여기다 넣으니까 그 애기가 무슨 죄가 있어요 세상에. 여기다 넣어서 죽였어요 아버지 손으로.
인기척만 나면 총을 계속 쏴서 그 안에 있는 사람들이 불안하고 또 총알을 맞아 죽고 이렇게 하니까 이제 하나같이 그 애기 때문에 다 죽으니까 다 죽을 여기 있는 사람들이 다 죽게 됐으니까 빨리 처치해라.
For 4 days and 3 nights, U.S. bullets continued to echo in the tunnel. Later, the Korean government confirmed that there were 150 deaths because of U.S. airstrikes and U.S. Army strafing. 13 had gone missing and 63 were injured. Also, it was officially confirmed that 71% of the casualties were the elderly, women, and children. But survivors say the number of actual casualties was much higher. No one knows exactly why the U.S. forces that had come to help evacuate the villagers fired machine guns and made aerial bomb attacks. After the incident, the survivors filed numerous petitions to the U.S. and Korean governments, starting in the 1960s, asking for a thorough investigation, an official apology, and compensation. But both governments ignored the request. Meanwhile, on September 29, 1999, the AP filed an exclusive story on the Nogunri massacre that was picked up by the major news organizations worldwide. At the core of the AP report is that what the survivors have claimed is true. The AP also interviewed an American soldier who took part in the Nogunri massacre.
Chandler said that he got orders to fire anything that can move, get rid of it.
Also, the AP revealed a document that stated that refugees should be treated as enemies. The very next day, President Clinton ordered an investigation into the Nogunri massacre.
To look into this, he wants to get to the bottom of it. He wants to examine all the available information and evidence.
On January 11, 2000, the U.S. investigation team visited President Kim Dae-jung at the presidential Blue House and promised a thorough investigation.
진상을 제대로 철저히 밝히고 여러 가지 사후 조치를 잘 마무리함으로써 이것이 한미 양국 간에 조금도 관계 손상이 안 될 뿐 아니라 오히려 상호 신뢰와 이해를 깊이 하는데 도움이 되어야 할 것이라고 생각합니다.
In October 1999, the U.S. government visited Nogunri for the first time to listen to the voices of the victims and look around the site. That was 49 years later, a far cry from the denial that the U.S. had expressed about Nogunri in the past. Before the investigation was carried out, the Korean government had suggested a joint investigation, but the U.S. opposed. As a result, the Korean and U.S. governments respectively formed their own investigation committees and conducted probes lasting 15 months. And on January 12, 2001, both investigative teams announced the results of their investigations.
오늘 한미 양국이 노군리 사건에 대한 공동조사 결과를 발표했습니다. 결론은 미군이 피난민들에게 총을 쏜 건 인정하지만 사격 명령에 대한 증거는 없다는 겁니다. 그래서 미국 정부는 피해자들에게 배상을 하지 않기로 했습니다.
U.S. soldiers killed or injured an unconfirmed number of Korean refugees in the last week of July of 1950.
A comprehensive search of records and these veterans' interviews did not disclose any evidence of the issuance of such an order.
The core of the investigation results agreed upon and announced by both Korea and the U.S. was that although the exact reason for the killings was unknown, the U.S. Army had indeed killed or injured a number of refugees in Nogunri. The U.S. government did not recognize any legal responsibility, however. In other words, the Nogunri massacre was defined as an unpremeditated act.
쟁점은 제가 보기에는 두 가지가 아니었는가 생각합니다. 하나는 노군리 사건은 정말 우발적으로 된 것이냐 아니면 위의 명령체계에 의해서 이루어진 것이냐. 우발적이라고 하면은 미 정부는 국가적인 관점에서 책임을 회피할 수가 있습니다. 그러나 명령체계에 의한 것이라고 한다면 정부 책임으로까지 소급이 됩니다.
쌍굴에 감금된 채 쌍굴에 갇혀서 미군에 의해서 소총과 기관총을 받은 기간이 무려 70시간이 넘습니다. 그게 어떻게 우발적인 사건입니까? 분명하게 의도적인 사건이라고 얘기할 수 있습니다. 그리고 그를 뒷받침하는 여러 가지 문서들이 미국 국립문서보관소에서 속속 발굴되어 있기 때문에 이것은 이제는 명확한 의도적 사건으로 규정할 수 있겠습니다.
In 2006, 5 years after the investigation, a very important document related to the Nogunri massacre was discovered at the U.S. National Archives. It was a letter written by Ambassador John J. Muchio. Muchio was the U.S. ambassador during the Korean War, and he reported the results of a meeting discussing refugee issues at Korea's interim government office in Daegu on July 25th, the day before the Nogunri massacre, to Dean Rusk, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. The content of the letter was very shocking. If refugees attempted to cross the U.S. line of defense, they will receive warning shots, and if the refugees persist in advancing, then they will be shot.
They may never lawfully fire on civilians. If civilians are advancing on them, they nonetheless remain non-combatants and may not be fired on. And that is simply contrary to the law of armed conflict, even as it stood in 1950.
Except the Korean War, other countries or other wars, have you seen any kind of orders being made?
No, I don't recall hearing such an order or hearing about such an order.
Muchio's letter was discovered by a researcher at the National Archives. He discovered the letter while researching his thesis on the Korean War.
I didn't realize the significance of the Muchio letter when I first saw it. It was only after the Associated Press reported about the Nogunri killings, and especially after the Department of Defense released its report on Nogunri, that I realized the significance of the letter.
When Dr. Sar Conway-Lance's thesis quoted Muchio's letter that clearly stated the permissible policy to shoot at refugees, the Associated Press cited Muchio's letter as being the most important piece of information concerning the Nogunri massacre and revealed it in its entirety on May 30th, 2006.
The letter from American Ambassador Muchio back to Washington saying that on July 25, the U.S. Army, in agreement with American civilian officials and South Korean civilian officials adopted a policy of firing on refugees approaching U.S. lines was the most important document that has surfaced during this whole inquiry, official and unofficial, over 10 years into Nogunri.
But in the Nogunri Review, released by the Department of the Army Inspector General, there was no mention of Muccio's letter.
That the Pentagon left even any mention or reference of this letter out of its final report completely mystifies me. How anyone could argue that this letter is not relevant to the killings at Nogunri, I find completely unconvincing.
They did not respond to our question about whether their investigators had found the Muccio letter in 2000 when they were doing their work.
In 2000, suspicions arose that the Pentagon had known of Muccio's letter during the Nogunri investigation. But the letter not only went unmentioned in the review, it was also not provided to the Korean government's investigation team. On the evening of July 25th, the day before the Nogunri massacre, U.S. Embassy officials and Korean government officials participated in a meeting held in the interim government office at the request of the 8th U.S. Army headquarters. In this meeting, talks specified that refugees must be treated from a military point of view and not as the subject of the relief effort. When the Korean War broke out, refugees poured out of their homes and headed south. There wasn't a policy to control the refugees in the beginning of the war. Then, these refugees became an extreme alerted target by the U.S. troops. In the beginning of the Korean War, as the U.S. troops lost battles, especially in Daejeon, and the military commander-in-chief went missing, the U.S. attributed the loss not only to the strong North Korean soldiers, but also to guerrilla attacks carried out from disguised refugees. A report that a camouflaged pregnant woman had carried a wireless device fueled the position, as well as rumors of artillery shells being hidden in the bags of refugees. In the end, on July 25th, 5 days after the Daejeon defeat, a policy to fire upon refugees in Daegu was decided. But despite such situations leading to the policy to fire on civilians, Ambassador Muccio was concerned that the policy could raise criticism of the U.S. in the future.
I think what he may be referring to there is potential criticism from other Americans about an implementation of a harsh policy.
As the Pentagon faced the allegation of covering up the existence of Muccio's letter, it said it had officially reported the reason to the Korean government for its omission during the investigation. The Chunju NBC made an official inquiry to the Korean Ministry of National Defense, asking for the reason the U.S. government had given. The Pentagon investigative team stated that firing on refugees was never recognized as a policy, and no order had been given in the field. Therefore, it felt Muccio's letter lacked significance.
Its excuse for not including it in the final report was that it was a proposal and not a policy. In the Muccio letter, it says in plain English that this was a decision that was made at a meeting last evening. But in 2007, responding to us, the U.S. Army decided to use this totally illogical reasoning, which simply does not jibe with the plain English of the document.
At 10 o'clock on July 26th, the very next day after the 8th U.S. Army headquarters held a meeting to decide its refugee policy, Lieutenant General Walker, who was also the commander-in-chief of the 8th U.S. Army and the Korean War, ordered the following guidelines of refugees to all of his subordinates. That was that they must never let the refugees cross the U.S. line of defense. The Commander-in-Chief's order was reported to General MacArthur at noon and immediately relayed to all of Walker's subordinate units. Then, if refugees fleeing from North Korean soldiers to the south were to approach a U.S. Army camp or U.S. war front without knowing that they were there, where else could they go?
You don't have to say explicitly, kill every refugee coming down. No one would give an order like that. What you have instead is an order that says, in order to protect your forces, in order to clear the way, the road for your forces to continue, you may do anything you have to do. That makes it quite clear that the refugees can be targeted.
There weren't many options that the orders left American soldiers. They could shout warnings, wave the civilians away from their front lines, they could fire warning shots, but as a last resort, they could fire at refugees, which is, I believe, what happened at Nogunri.
After receiving orders from the 8th U.S. Army to handle the refugee issues, commanders of each subordinate unit relayed more concrete orders to units that fell under their control. The commander of the 25th Infantry Division said that all civilians seen in the area were to be considered as enemy and action taken accordingly. According to the War Journal of the 1st Cavalry Division, 61st Artillery Battalion, now anyone seen is considered enemy. And in the 25th Infantry Division's War Journal, any refugees approaching our defense position will be considered as an enemy and will be dispersed by all available means, including artillery. But in the case of Nogunri, where rifles and even mortars were fired, no document depicting such orders was found. It was the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Regiment in the 1st Cavalry Division that had fired on the refugees. The Pentagon's investigation team came to the final conclusion that this battalion was not ordered to fire on the refugees because no document was found to prove such an order. Our production crew visited a Korean War veteran who was an Army clerk of the 7th Regiment. Standing in front of Cheongju MBC's camera for the very first time, he vividly remembered the events that occurred 59 years ago.
I know General, oh my God, the 1st Cavalry Commander. I was just thinking about him this morning, and I can't think of his name now. You got me befuddled. But I know that he ordered civilians in that area to be killed.
Mac Hilliard was in the 7th Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division, and the Commander-in-Chief was General Hobart Gay.
And this came down, I saw the order written order from General Gay, and it was my understanding that this was an order that had come all the way down from 8th Army headquarters.
Mac Hilliard testified clearly that he had seen the actual handwritten report right after the Nogunri incident, which stated that soldiers had fired on refugees in twin tunnels.
The original report, as I recall, said that American forces had opened fire on 300 civilians from Nogunri who had been hiding in a railroad tunnel and had come out when the Americans came. Yes, I was sitting in a tent typing out the battalion handwritten reports, and I recall seeing that, and I commented about it to a couple of other people there in the tent with me.
The war diary that you type it out,
Yes.
the communication log is missing.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, we can't find it anywhere, and the Pentagon doesn't know where that is.
This is not surprising. You know, it's not the first time that incriminating or embarrassing documents have disappeared.
This is the copy of the testimony Mac Hilliard gave to the Pentagon during the Nogunri investigation in 2000. But the U.S. investigative team did not include this document in its review. General Gay, the commander-in-chief of the 1st Cavalry Division, had reportedly given orders for the 7th Regiment to fire on the refugees. He called upon his subordinate unit, the 61st Artillery Battalion, and ordered that all refugees on this side of the north firing line are fair game. He was already ordering subordinates to fire on the refugees on July 24th, 2 days before the 8th U.S. Army had come up with guidelines on refugee control. This document of the 8th Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division was discovered by AP and exclusively reported on the orders. But despite the fact the order was directed at the same division, the memorandum of orders in the 7th Regiment is missing.
거기에 그러니까 내린 명령이 없다는 거 아닙니까? 옆에 부대는 있는데 같은 사단 내에서도. 그러니까 그들의 주장은 그렇다고 생각합니다. 그러나 군대 속성상, 군의 속성상 어느 곳에 명령이 내려갔는데 다른 예하 부대는 같은 조건 하에서 내려보내지 않았다 하는 것은 납득하기 힘들다고 말할 수 있습니다.
Eugene Hesselman, who had testified about the shooting orders to the AP, refused to give an official testimony to the U.S. Investigation Committee. The reason was because of the U.S. Secretary and the Army's Caldera statement. Secretary Caldera had already stated in several press conferences that if a soldier had fired on the refugees although there was no order to shoot, the U.S. government would hold the soldier personally responsible and they would be punished.
칼데라의 그 증언자에 대한 그 일종의 협박, 그건 굉장한 협박입니다. 그러니까 그거 말 잘못했다가는 지금이라도 그냥 소추돼 가지고 감옥에 가야 된다 생각하니까 입 다물죠. AP 통신을 통해서 증언한 사람들이 있지 않습니까? 자칫하다 보면 자기가 범죄에 걸리니까 그때부터는 증언을 안 하는 거예요.
Korea's investigation committee expressed deep concerns about Secretary Caldera's statement and asked that immunity from punishment to the soldiers who testified be granted. But the Pentagon refused. Our production team tried to track down and interview the American veterans who had long asserted that there were shooting orders, but most of them had already passed away or could not be reached. And the very few men we had contacted refused to give an interview.
The old man, yes, right down the line, he's running, kill them all. So what do? And of course, there was a lieutenant screaming like a madman to fire on everything. Fire on everything! I shot too. Shot at people. I don't know if they were soldiers or what. Kids, there was kids out there. It didn't matter what it was. 8 to 80, blind, crippled, or crazy, they shot them.
Joe Jackman, who had vividly testified to the shooting orders on a BBC documentary program, died in 2004. And it is unclear whether or not he gave an official testimony to the U.S. Investigation Committee.
He said, go down, take the machine gun, shoot those people, and we'll pull out. I said, we can't kill all these people. And he pulled out his handgun, a .45, and pointed it at my head, and he said, I said, kill them. Said, you're disobeying a direct order in combat. He says, I will kill you myself. He said, go back there and kill those people. I said, yes, sir. I turned and I'm running.
After the BBC documentary aired George Early's interview, he immediately reversed his testimony of the shooting.
조지 얼리 씨가 요즘 말끝을 흐리고 있습니다. 말을 바꾸고 있습니다. 미국 정부로부터 모종의 압력을 받은 것이 아니냐 하는 의혹이 일고 있습니다.
인터뷰에 응하겠다고 해서 지난 18일 오하이오 톨레도에 있는 그의 집을 찾았지만 그는 문도 따주지 않았습니다. 지난 21일 성조지와의 회견에서는 중대장이 불가피한 경우에만 발표하라고 했다고 말을 흐렸습니다. 오늘 전화 인터뷰에서는 발포 명령이 내려진 것은 노군리와는 전혀 다른 현장이었다고 번복했습니다.
That was earlier, another incident earlier. That was before Nogunri.
얼리 씨는 국방부로부터 조사는 받았지만 결코 압력이나 회유를 받은 적은 없다고 말했습니다. 그렇지만 그의 말은 점점 국방부 측의 주장과 흡사해지고 있습니다.
The U.S. Investigation Committee claimed that there was no airstrike near Nogunri at that time, after reviewing the documents and interviewing veterans.
미국에서 거짓말을 하는 거지 실제로 그때 지금 부상당해가지고 살아있는 사람이 아직 수십 명 있는데 그 사람들 말이 전부 다 지금 거짓말이라 하면 얘기도 안 되는 거고.
Chungbuk National University performed an excavation at the scene of the Nogunri massacre in 2008 and found the remains of what appeared to be a bomb dropped by the U.S. Air Force.
폭탄의 그 앞머리 인접으로 봐서 그 노군리 사건 당시 현장에 그 투하됐던 그런 그 폭탄이 아닌가 이렇게 추정하고 있습니다.
The U.S. review of the Nogunri massacre included a situation map of an airstrike in the Yeongdong area on the day of July 26th. But not a single aerial bomb is marked on the map in Nogunri, but all of the aerial bombs are marked concentrating on Yeongdong-up, which was taken over by North Korean troops. The review states that there was an air attack 3 miles south of Yongamni, which includes Nogunri, at 6:40 p.m. on July 26th, but this is not marked on the map. This is a mission report filed by the U.S. Air Force pilots who conducted the air attacks at 6:20 and 6:40 respectively. No mission reports were filed around noon, which was the time of the attack that the victims have testified to. Most of the reports filed before 6:20 are missing.
35-11, 12 이 제목을 봤을 때 그 35는 35 그 중대를 말을 하는 거고 미 공군의 35 중대를 말하는 거고 11, 12 이 말은 그 출격 횟수를 말하는 거거든요. 그러니까 저녁 6시 무렵에 11번째 출격, 6시 40분 무렵에 12번째 출격이란 말이죠. 그러면은 앞에 있었던 1번부터 10번까지 출격이 있었을 것이고 그 1번부터 10번까지 출격 사이에는 정오 부분에 출격이 있었지 않았을까 하는 추론을 쉽게 할 수 있는 것이죠.
Mandatory for every pilot to write what they did.
Everybody comes back from a mission and sits down at a table with the guy that's interviewing them for the thing, best wheel, and it gives a thing of what he saw and how he saw it and how he saw it.
And if there was an air attack, the mission report about that air attack is missing.
Well, that's I can tell you where it is if it's missing. It's in a headquarters someplace under our lock and key.
The U.S. Investigation Committee assures us that even if there were air attacks near Nogunri area, none were deliberately aimed at civilians. However, in 2000, during the investigation, a memo was discovered. It was written by Colonel Rogers, who was the staff officer in charge of the airstrikes of the 5th Air Force, to his superior on July 25th, right before the Nogunri massacre. It is reported that large groups of civilians, either composed of or controlled by North Korean soldiers, are infiltrating U.S. positions. The Army has reported that we strafe all civilian refugee parties that are noted approaching our positions. To date, we have complied with the Army's request in this respect. Our operations involving the strafing of civilians is sure to receive wide publicity and may cause embarrassment to the U.S. Air Force and to the U.S. government in its relation with the United Nations. It is not understood why the Army is not screening such personnel or shooting them as they come through if they desire such action. It is recommended that a policy be established whereby 5th Air Force aircraft will not attack civilian refugees unless they are definitely known to contain North Korean soldiers or commit hostile acts. It is further recommended that we so inform 8th Army Headquarters. Although Rogers' memorandum indicates that attacks on civilians were common practice, the U.S. Investigation Committee tried to retrench its importance by saying it was just a reference to a single discussion. But another report filed by an Air Force pilot that supported Rogers' memorandum was discovered. Some people in white clothes were strafed 3 to 4 miles south of Yusong. They could have been refugees because much baggage was seen piled on riverbanks in Yusong. We attacked people gathered near a riverbank who appeared to be evacuees. But none of this report was mentioned at all in the U.S. Nogunri Review. We requested an interview with the U.S. Department of Defense concerning the questions we've raised thus far, but we were not given any answers. Pete McCloskey is 82 years old this year. He is a Korean War veteran and is a former member of the House of Representatives. He also served on the advisory committee during the Nogunri investigations. When the investigations were coming to a close, he sent a letter to a high-ranking official at the Department of Defense. He said that the U.S. Army should acknowledge that the strafing on refugees was deliberate and that they were ordered to do so. But the Pentagon did not accept McCloskey's opinion.
The problem was that the Army didn't want to admit that the Army officers had played a role in the shooting. And I think there was a general feeling that the Army was being overly protective, but I think I was the only one who wrote a strong dissent that I thought the Army report was a whitewash.
After the investigation, former U.S. President Bill Clinton announced in a statement that he deeply regretted that Korean civilians lost their lives at Nogunri. But no legal responsibility was taken. The U.S. government offered reparations to the Nogunri victims. $1.19 million for the erection of a monument and $2.8 million for a scholarship fund, which totaled $4 million. But the victims and the surviving family members immediately refused to accept this. It was because the reparations were not directed to victims of Nogunri, but for all Koreans who were victimized by U.S. troops during the Korean War. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there are over 500 filed petitions against U.S. troops during the Korean War. Some 60 were filed at the time of the Nogunri investigation. But despite its promise, the U.S. Investigation Committee has not yet launched another investigation on other similar cases. Lawyers who took on the Nogunri case in the U.S. have been fighting for 10 years for the truth and compensation. But we have yet to see substantial results from the U.S. government or the Congress. The investigation into the Nogunri massacre was carried out half a century after it happened, only to be concluded it was an accident. But the victims and surviving family members still refuse to succumb to the feelings until now, 10 years after the investigation ended. Not being able to receive any reparations from the U.S. for what had happened, they gather in front of a humble grave to remember the unjustly killed innocent victims. What is the U.S. to these people in terms of the Nogunri massacre?
미국 정부는 한국 전쟁 당시에 희생된 미군들의 시신을 지금도 많은 돈을 들여서 찾고 있고 그들의 명예를 회복시켜주는 일을 하고 있습니다. 그건 정말 저는 잘한 일이라고 생각합니다. 그런데 지금 노구리 사건으로 희생된 돌아가신 분들을 위한 명예회복 사업 미국 정부 한 게 아무것도 없습니다. 그리고 더군다나 지금 노구리 사건으로 그 사건 이후 60년 가까이 그 가슴에 한과 아픔과 슬픔을 가지고 살아가는 이들에 대해서 생존 피해자들에 대해서도 한 게 아무것도 없습니다.